Hello everyone, and welcome to this section of the course on behavioural ecology and evolutionary ecology. I'm Tanmay Dixit. I'm a PhD student at the University of Cambridge, studying brood parasites and hosts, which I will talk about a little bit in a later lecture. But to start off with, what is behavioural ecology or evolutionary ecology? These terms generally refer to the study of kind of optimality in animal behavior, the selection pressures leading to behavior and ecology. Why do organisms have as many offspring as they do? Why do organisms mate with specific other individuals? And so this encompasses a really broad range of aspects from natural history, evolution, ecology, behavior. And also, of course, all of these things have a genetic basis, as you've learnt in previous sections of the course. So, this section of the course is going to comprise four main sections. Firstly, kin selection, second, life history, third, coevolution, and fourth, sexual selection. The coevolution block is going to be split a little bit to do justice to the topic, and kin selection is going to show up in both the first and the second lecture. So I'm going to give an introduction to it today, and Jan Kreider is going to talk a little bit about kin selection when he gives his lecture on life history, particularly in the context of eusociality. So let's get started by looking at why organisms form the groups and exhibit some of the behaviours that they do, particularly towards kin. And so we're going to talk today about kin selection and inclusive fitness. You can see lots of different organisms band together in groups, behave in ways that might seem at first to be against their own interests by helping others and even foregoing reproduction themselves. And we're going to look at the explanations for this and the implications of it for evolution and our understanding of it. So we're going to go through 6 things in this lecture. Firstly, why do we see altruism? Second, a brief mention about group selection. Third, the real detail of inclusive fitness, in particular the formalization that is Hamilton's rule and kin selection in general. Fourth, a worked example to illustrate Hamilton's rule. 5, a generalization of Hamilton's rule. And 6, one section that I very rarely see in lectures on kin selection, and I think it's very useful, is to talk about a misunderstanding of kin selection, which has certainly helped me to understand it in the past. So let's start with, why do we see altruism? So why altruism? Well, to illustrate the problem, Darwin wrote, "If it could ever be shown that individuals repeatedly and reliably sacrifice their own fitness to increase the fitness of others, the theory of natural selection would be refuted." And that's a big problem for evolution, because we see this all the time in nature. For example, meerkats will teach the offspring of others, protect the offspring of others, feed the offspring of others in their troop, foregoing reproduction by doing so. A lot of eusocial insects, such as these bees, have sterile casts which don't breed, completely foregoing reproduction in favour of looking after the queen and caring for her offspring. And even outside of the realm of reproduction, organisms waste energy behaving altruistically to other members of their species, and that uses up energy that could have been used in finding a mate or reproducing themselves. And so altruism, this behaviour that carries a cost to oneself but benefits another, really does require an explanation, as Darwin clearly noted. So we're going to go through a few explanations of why we might see altruism in nature. We're not going to go into all of them in detail, but these are a few potential explanations. So one is reciprocal altruism, which is essentially I scratch your back, you scratch mine. So if I help you, then that may carry a cost to me at the time, but if you later help me, then I will recoup the benefits of helping you. And potentially, if I help you in your time of need, then you could help me in my time of need. And therefore I could get even greater benefits by helping you than if I didn't. So that's reciprocal altruism. Another potential route by which we might see organisms helping each other is coercion, if they're being forced to do so. So if a more dominant or stronger individual is forcing another one to help it, then that would be an example of coercion, and we would see such altruism, arguably altruism in inverted commas, in nature. Another is shared interests. So if organisms actually simply share an interest, like perhaps parents do with looking after their own offspring, then of course they'll help the other individual because they're actually getting a benefit. Again, arguably this isn't altruism because they're not suffering a cost, but it's a reason that we might see organisms helping each other in nature. The fourth one, which is very controversial and we're going to talk about a little bit, is group selection. This idea that selection at the level of the group can maintain altruistic behaviors. So, for instance, if birds reduce their reproduction in times of hardship when there's not much food around, then maybe the species will survive, whereas the species might not survive had they been selfish and tried to reproduce as much as they possibly could. And so the argument there is that the species that survive are the ones where individuals are altruistic. And we'll go into that in a bit more detail in a second. But the fifth explanation that we're going to talk about in much more detail this lecture is inclusive fitness. So now let's talk briefly about group selection and about the controversy surrounding. So, one claim that might be made by a group selectionist is that these birds, red grouse, will limit reproduction to prevent the population from exceeding the food supply. So in other words, if there's a food shortage, if the food supply is low, then they will reduce their reproduction in order to stop the entire food supply being used up, such that the population might later go extinct. And to see what's wrong with this claim, we might want to use a game theoretical view. So consider a cheat, a selfish individual that does not limit its reproduction. Well, it will do much better than the other individuals in the population, and therefore its genes are going to spread through the population because it's going to have the most offspring. And so selection at the level of the individual might outweigh selection at the level of the group. And what we would therefore say is that the behavior of limiting reproduction when there are food shortages is not evolutionarily stable, because a cheat can invade and that gene could spread through the entire population. And so that does lead to the question, does group selection never work? And it's unlikely because of this issue of selection at the level of the individual outweighing selection at the level of the group. But I think it's not impossible. There are lots of good arguments for group selection having occurred in certain situations. That's probably beyond the remit. That is beyond the remit of this lecture. But if you're interested, it might be worth reading up on that. So now, having dealt with group selection, let's look at inclusive fitness. So we're going to take a selfish gene perspective for this. So it's not the individual survival that matters. Individuals don't survive. They don't copy themselves. But it's the genes, and technically the alleles. So these genes, or alleles, are selfish, but that they can produce altruism. And the way in which this might work is that genes are also present in relatives. And so it could benefit an individual's genes for that individual to help other related individuals, because those related individuals would carry, with some probability, would carry the same genes. And this would be the case as long as the benefits to those individuals outweigh the cost to itself. The problem is this has to be weighted by relatedness, which is the probability that individuals will share alleles by descent. And this was formalized by Bill Hamilton in 1964. So what Hamilton said is, let's B the benefit of the behavior. So that's the increase in the relative's fitness as a result of receiving help. C is the cost, i.e. the decrease in the donor's fitness as the result of providing help. So if I help some relative of mine to increase their fitness, then I will have provided them a benefit, but probably at a cost to myself, because I could have used that energy into my own direct fitness. And R was the coefficient of relatedness, the probability that a gene in the donor and in the recipient are identical by descent. And again, I say gene here, I really mean allele, but usually in the literature, people talk about genes, which is why I've used that term here. So the formula for Hamilton's rule says that R multiplied by B must be greater than 1 multiplied by C for altruism to be favoured. Now the reason for this is we need to weight the benefits and the costs by the relatedness. So we weight the benefit to you by your relatedness to me if I'm helping you, and we weight the cost that I'm experiencing by my relatedness to myself, which is 1. And so essentially this rearranges very simply as RB minus C must be greater than 0 for altruism to be favoured. And if it helps to put this in words, the increase in the relative's fitness as a result of help multiplied by the relatedness to that relative must be greater than the decrease in the donor's fitness as a result of the act multiplied by relatedness to itself, and relatedness to itself is 1. Now, how do we calculate these relatednesses? So we're not going to go through this diagram in particular detail, but the important thing to think of is how how probable is it that an allele in an individual will be the same as an allele in another individual by descent. In other words, it's the probability that 2 individuals share an allele due to recent common ancestry. So, parents. Well, you get half of your genes from your father and half of your genes from the mother. And so the probability that a gene in you is in your parents is a half. And actually that's that works the other way, I should say, that the probability that a gene in your in your parents is in you is also a half. For full siblings, it's also a half. The probability that a gene in me is in my sister is a half. For half-sibs, it's a quarter. For cousins, it's an eighth. And so one can look at this in detail, and I'll give you a formula in a moment for how to work these relatednesses out. But the point here is, if you help a full sibling to raise 2 extra children, then you get the same genetic profit as raising an offspring of your own. So if you're helping a sibling to raise 2 children, then you're essentially then the benefit of 2 extra children would be multiplied by the relatedness, which is a half, which makes 1. And the genetic profit you get by raising an offspring of your own is obviously 1. You're raising 1 offspring. And so those are equivalent. And that's why the biologist J.B.S. Haldane once said, "I would gladly give up my life for 2 brothers or 8 cousins." Because 2 times a half is 1, and 8 times an eighth is also 1. And obviously he was being metaphorical, I think, but the point there is, in evolutionary terms, 2 siblings are worth the same as 1 cell. So how do we calculate these relatednesses? Well, what we can do is, let's look at, say, half siblings. So this is the actor, this is the focal individual. What's the probability that its genes are in a shared parent, a parent? Well, the answer is a half. It gets half of its genes from its parent. The recipient also gets half of its genes from its parent if it's a half sibling. They only share 1 parent, of course, if they're half siblings. And so what you do is you multiply these, a half times half, to get a quarter. For full siblings, you have to do the same thing, so a half times a half to get a quarter, but there are 2 parents in common, so you need to add it to the other parent. So with the father, it's a half times a half to make a quarter, and with the mother, it's a half times a half to make a quarter, together a half. For cousins, we again look at the actor's relatedness to one of its parents, because cousins, you either have a cousin on your father's side or your mother's side. The relatedness of an actor to an actor's parent is a half. That actor's parent to that parent's brother or sister, so the aunt or uncle of the actor, is a half, and the recipient is a child of that individual and therefore is a half. And so you have a half times a half times a half, which gives you an eighth, as you saw on the previous slide. Now, actually, there's a very simple, formula to work out R. So what you do is you take a half and you multiply it by the number of generation links in the chain. So in this chain, there are 2. And so you multiply you don't multiply a half by 2, you take it to the power of 2. Sorry, that L is to the power of. And so in this case, because there are 2 links in the chain, you do a half squared, which is a quarter. And this sum here says that needs to be done for every link for every chain, and every chain needs to be added together. So if you take this full siblings example, there are 2 links in the chain via the father, so that's a half squared, which is a quarter, and there are two links in the chain via the mother, so that's a half squared again, which is again a quarter, and you take the sum for all of the possible chains between those individuals. And for full siblings, there are 2 chains, one via the father, one via the mother, and therefore it's a quarter plus a quarter, which is a half. So this is all very theoretical. Let's do a worked example. And we're going to look at wild turkeys, which sometimes breed cooperatively. So what you find is that pairs of males will sometimes work together to court, to attract, and to defend females from other males. And what we find is the dominant male does father offspring, but the subordinate gains no matings, so presumably does not father any offspring. So why on earth is the subordinate helping? Well, first, people measured the relatedness between the 2 males. So this this measure of relatedness is between the 2 males. And the value they found was 0.42, which is not significantly different from them being full siblings. So probably most of the time these 2 males are brothers. And here's how Hamilton's rule might look. So, firstly, R, the coefficient of relatedness between the 2 males, is 0.42, as we saw on the previous slide. Now, the benefit to the dominant of producing extra young is 6.1. And now this was calculated because the dominant male will produce 7 offspring on average if he's partnered with a subordinate. But a solitary male would only produce 0.9 offspring on average. And so the benefit to the dominant of having the help of the subordinate is 6.1. That's 7 minus 0.9. The cost to subordinate of sacrificing his own reproduction to help the dominant male is the number of offspring he would gain on his own, which, as we said before, was 0.9. So together they get an average of 7. On their own, they would get an average of 0.9. So now we can see, is Hamilton's rule satisfied? And if we, and remember Hamilton's rule is RB minus C must be greater than 0. R times B is 0.42 times 6.1 minus C, which is 0.9, gives us a value of 1.7, which is indeed greater than 0. So this illustrates, or at least provides good evidence as to why subordinates help, is that they're gaining inclusive fitness that outweighs the loss of their own direct fitness, the loss of their own offspring, but that occurs if they help. So let's look at some other examples very briefly. So there's high relatedness in social insects that Jan is going to talk about in the next lecture. And they clearly help each other to an enormous degree. Indeed, in many cases, there is only a single individual that breeds, and all of the others help. Similarly, another example of helpers at the nest is cooperative breeding in birds. This often is the case because helpers are previous years young. So this bird, the superb fairy wren, is a bird that exhibits such cooperative breeding, where previous years young that haven't got a territory will stay behind and help to rear what would be their siblings, their younger siblings. In elephant herds, all females are typically related. Elephant herds are entirely female, apart from apart from offspring, which if they're male, will stay with the herd until they are ready to leave and go off on their own. And there's even selection for cooperation in bacterial clones, and of course clones have a relatedness of 1; they're identical. So it's unsurprising that there's selection for cooperation there. And arguably, even in examples of humans, the grandmother hypothesis suggests that a reason for the female menopause, the lack of the impossibility of women breeding after a certain age, is that it actually benefits them more to look after their grandchildren than to raise more children of their own. Okay, now let's have a look at a generalization of Hamilton's rule, having looked at this specific. So let's look at this with these lovely squirrels, and we're going to look at all of the possible interactions that a pair of organisms could have. So this squirrel is the donor, that's performing the act, and the recipient that's receiving whatever the act produces. So what we've been looking at so far is altruism. That's where the donor suffers a cost, but helps the recipient. So the recipient gets a benefit, the donor suffers a cost. In this bottom left box, we have cooperation. That's where the donor and the recipient both benefit from the donor's behavior. Selfishness is where the donor benefits at cost to the recipient. It's being selfish. And spite is where the donor and the recipient both suffer costs as a result of the interaction. And you might be thinking, why on earth would that happen? Who's benefiting from that? And we'll get onto that in a moment. The general condition that's required for an allele to spread is m plus rn equals 0. M is the effect of an action on direct fitness, so the amount that you invest in your own offspring. So if m is negative, then the action reduces your direct fitness. If m is positive, then that increases your direct fitness. So it's just what you do to produce your own offspring. Here you can see the actor producing its own offspring. Ignore this R1 and R2, by the way. This is just a different way of framing Hamilton's rule, which we're not going to talk about. N is the effect of an action on investment into another individual's offspring. So A positive n implies that the actor is helping the recipient to produce offspring, and a negative n implies that it's harming the recipient to produce offspring, so preventing the recipient from producing offspring or reducing the number of offspring the recipient can produce. And R is the relatedness between the actor and the recipient, as we've discussed before. So, what does m plus Rn needing to be greater than 0 for an allele to spread, what does this mean for relatedness? So, in the case of cooperation, m and n are both positive, and m plus nr, or m plus rn, just has to be greater than 0. In the case of selfishness, m is positive because you're getting a benefit, but the value for n would be negative because you are harming another individual. And so m plus nr is greater than 0 requires that m has to be bigger than nr. For altruism, it's essentially the other way around. You're harming yourself, so m is negative, and you're helping another individual with a certain relatedness, and so n must be positive. In the case of spite, we have the situation where both m and n are negative, and what that requires is that r also has to be negative. If you just think about the mathematics, if you have a negative number plus a negative number, that's always going to be less than 0. So what you need is r to be negative to make this nr term a positive number, and that might exceed the value of m. And negative relatedness might occur if individuals are less closely related to a certain individual than average in the population. That can create a negative relatedness. And what that means is by harming the other individual, you're by extension helping its competitors, which are more closely related to you than that individual. So if you're negatively related to an individual, let's call him Fred. If you're negatively related to Fred, then you might be spiteful towards Fred, harming yourself, but actually by being spiteful and harming Fred as well, you're helping Fred's competitors to do better, and Fred's competitors are much more closely related to you than you are to Fred, because you're negatively related to Fred. And here's a paper discussing that, which you can look at if you're interested. I think I've highlighted this sentence because I think it's very useful. Specifically, spite can be favoured when harming the less similar individuals in a social group, primary recipients, reduces competition and therefore benefits the unharmed individuals, secondary recipients. In this case, negative relatedness arises because the actor's genetic similarity to primary recipients is less than its genetic similarity to secondary recipients. So the point here is that the primary recipients are these individuals that are negatively related to the actor, and the secondary recipients are the competitors of the primary recipients, which benefit from the actor's spiteful actions to the primary recipient. Okay, the final thing that I want to talk about today is a misunderstanding of kin selection. And this paper, this Dawkins paper 12 misunderstandings of kin selection, is a really useful one to look at if you're at all confused. He goes through 12 very easy misunderstandings to make, and I'm just going to go through one of them, and that's that I share 98% of my genes with a chimpanzee, so shouldn't I be kin selected to help chimpanzees? And actually, I share 50% of my genes with a banana. And if my relatedness to my sibling is 50%, isn't my relatedness to a banana 50%? Shouldn't I then be selected to help the banana? And certainly not eat it. And in general, all individuals within a species share way more than 99% of genes. So what is this relatedness term that can be a half or an eighth between siblings and cousins when all individuals share 99% of genes, all individuals within a species? And the answer to all of this is that it's all to do with evolutionarily stable strategies, as we're going to go through now. So misunderstanding 5 in Dawkins' paper is all members of a species share more than 99% of their genes, so why shouldn't selection favour universal altruism to anyone else within the species? And Dawkins goes through the logic, which I've kind of summarised into hopefully a simple logical train of thought. So imagine that there are two strategies: universal altruist, which we'll call U, and kin altruist, K. So U individuals care for any member of the species indiscriminately, so they'll care for anybody. They're very nice. K individuals are a bit more nepotistic. They care for close kin only. In both cases, the caring behaviour will cost the altruist something in terms of their personal survival chances. So now let's imagine that the entire population is made up of universal altruists, and a tiny minority of mutants or immigrants are kin altruists. So superficially, the U gene appears to be caring for copies of itself, since the beneficiaries of its indiscriminate altruism are almost bound to contain the same gene, because the entire population just about is universal altruists. But is it evolutionarily stable against invasion by rare K genes? Well, no, it isn't. Because every time a K individual behaves altruistically, it's especially likely to benefit another K individual rather than a U individual, because it only takes care of kin, and kin are more likely to contain the K allele than the U allele. U individuals, on the other hand, will give out altruism to both K individuals and U individuals indiscriminately, because the defining characteristic of U behavior is that it's indiscriminate. It's a universal altruist. So therefore, K genes will spread through the population at the expense of U genes. Universal altruism is therefore not evolutionarily stable against kin altruism. Even if we assume it to be initially common, it won't remain common. It will be invaded by kin altruism. And that's why it's not stable for selection, for universal altruism, and therefore selection will not favour universal altruism. It will favour kin altruism. So just to finish off with, I just want to mention a couple of controversies and alternative explanations. So one is this idea of multi-level selection, which has been this view that's been proposed in some cases an alternative to kin selection, in some cases alongside kin selection. It's a huge argument in the literature. Multi-level selection argues that there's selection at the level of genes, which is really what we've been talking about. We've been thinking of this from the selfish gene perspective, but also at the level of individuals and the level of lineages and the level of populations and the level of species, the level of groups in general. And that we shouldn't be framing looking at evolution solely in the context of genetic, in the context of selection acting on genes, but we should think of selection acting on all of these different levels: genes, individuals, groups, and looking at the ways in which those interact. And there's a lot of proponents for multi-level selection theory. Some of the proponents, I think, completely ignore kin selection and disavow kin selection, which I personally firmly disagree with. I think kin selection is well established and has a sound theoretical and empirical basis, as I hope I've illustrated. But that doesn't mean there isn't anything to multi-level selection, and in fact, I think there probably is. But yes, if you're interested, feel free to read up on that. And less of a controversy, but more just other explanations for cooperation, as I mentioned in one of my early slides, is there are all of these other explanations like coercion, reciprocity, shared interests, and so on. And there's a lovely paper by West, Griffin, and Gardner on that in Current Biology called Evolutionary Explanations for Cooperation. So I'd also recommend having a look at that if you get time. Further reading for this lecture, some of these you'll have looked at already. So the general textbook for for behavioral ecology, I think that if you have access to it, would be worthwhile looking at in detail. It's beautifully written, really lovely explanations, and very clear. So that's the Davis, Krebs and West Introduction to Behavioral Ecology. So chapter 11 is on kin selection, and there's also sections on haplodiploidy that Jan is going to introduce in the next lecture. West, Griffin and Gardner's paper in Current Biology that I mentioned on the previous slide is very lovely in going through kin selection and other explanations for cooperation. I also mentioned Dawkins's 12 Misunderstandings of Kin Selection, definitely worth a read and quite nicely and easily written. And Dawkins' The Selfish Gene, which I'm sure many of you will have heard of, is a really good primer for kind of evolutionary biology and game theory, and leading on to things like behavioral ecology. So I strongly recommend having a look at that. It's the thing that got me very interested in evolutionary biology when I was at school. It's a really good book. Also has sections on haplodiploidy that are very useful. So thank you all very much. I hope you found this useful, and I will the next lecture from Jan will be on life history, particularly senescence and eusociality, and then I'll be back to talk about coevolution.